All right, I think we're ready to get started. So welcome back. We're really excited to have Radhika Desai with us here today. Radhika is professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada. She's the author of numerous books. I'll just reference a few. Geopolitical Economy, After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization and Empire, Slouching Towards, and the pronunciation? Ayodhya. Which was from it had a second revised edition in 2004, and an earlier book, Intellectuals and Socialism, Social Democrats and the Labor Party from 1994. She is also the author of numerous articles in Economic and Political Weekly, New Left Review, Third World Quarterly, and other journals, and edited collections on various issues such as parties, political economy, culture, and nationalism. She co-edits the Future of Capitalism book series with Pluto Press with Alan Freeman, who's going to be here to speak with us tomorrow. And she's the convener of a very important and interesting and relatively recent kind of intellectual platform called the International Manifesto Group that I encourage all of you to check out if you're not familiar with it. It kind of lays everything out, and they've been doing excellent webinars on contemporary issues and geopolitics, economics, contemporary social and cultural issues. So Radhika, thank you so much for joining us. Our first question today is very general. We'd like you to kind of briefly outline your theoretical and practical itinerary. What has brought you to your current views on the world, and how did you come to them through the academy, but also your kind of political interests? And we'll just turn that mic on.
So first of all, I just want to say thanks so much to Gabriel and Jennifer for organizing this, for inviting me, and presenting such a perceptive set of questions that I feel really privileged in being able to answer them. And I would say that this, if we really answer these questions, we'll be here till tomorrow morning. So clearly we're going to pick and choose in answering these questions. And in fact, in the answer to the first question, where again, ask anybody about themselves, at least somebody like me, and I will talk for hours. So instead of talking for hours in the first question, what I'm going to do is just mention some of the highlights, which I may go back to later on, but what I consider important. And I should say also that at different stages in my life, I'm old enough to realize that at different stages in my life, I have highlighted different things. So, but with that preface, let me just say that perhaps one of the most important things about me is the fact that I was born and raised in India. I was born and raised there, and I finished my first degree there before coming to Canada to study. So, the thing about that for me, in retrospect, is that I was born in a time when the idea of the developmental state in India was still very alive. It always leaned substantially to the left. I wouldn't say that I was always a convinced Marxist. In fact, I didn't become a convinced Marxist until after I came to Canada and studied Marxism systematically for the first time. Because although there is a very strong Marxist tradition in India, this was not true of the part of India from which I come. And so at university, my professors simply dismissed Marx in a couple of sentences, and that was that in a history of political thought course, and for the rest one learned liberal stuff. So I then came to Canada, to Queen's University to study, and there, number one, I studied Marx systematically for the first time, and for me, once I learned about it, to me the most important thing about Marxism was not that it had the best answers or anything. It was the ambition of the questions it was asking. No other tradition of thought that I had encountered asked such a range of questions, such penetrating questions, and having grown up in India, one of the things that I always found interesting is why is it that people think they are changing some things, but they somehow don't seem to change, that things don't improve, etc. So what was going on? And it seemed to me that Marxism offered some of the most important tools to understand it. So once I learned it, as I say, I dove into the deep end, and I've kind of stayed there ever since. I write as a Marxist, I consider myself a Marxist, and as I say, once I began to study it, I just couldn't have enough of it, and I just read as far as possible. Eventually I familiarized myself not just with second-hand ideas about Marxism, but the works of Marx and Engels themselves, 3 volumes of Capital, all the major economic writings, and as many of the other voluminous writings that I can lay my hands on. So I became intellectually a Marxist later, but at the same time I would say my formation in India has always led me not only to some kind of a broadly Marxist understanding, but I would say also a communist rather than a Second International or a Trotskyist understanding. So that has been a kind of a gravitational pull for me. Another thing about India, this directly connects with my ideas about geopolitical economy, where I say that it's not just about political economy, that is to say class and class struggle, etc., but geopolitical economy. Therefore, you have to put nation and class in the same frame in order to understand what's going on. And I would say that the best Marxist historians and scholars do it implicitly anyway, but I've tried to sort of put a theoretical framework on it. And a very early part of the engagement on this came out when I did a kind of a project on nationalism. I called it Developmental and Cultural Nationalisms, where to me there had been such a big shift in India from the sort of developmental nationalism of the Congress era, the developmental era, when India was attempting a socialistic path of development. And then by the late 1980s, early 1990s, and since then we have had the rise of Hindu nationalism. So I wanted to understand how did this transition take place, and I broadly understood it as a shift from developmentalism to neoliberalism, etc., which we can go into. Let me just put it this way. The terms developmental and cultural nationalisms were sort of chosen for the want of a better alternative. So developmental nationalism refers to the Nehruvian sort of nationalism, the cultural nationalism refers to Hindutva, but of course both have economic and cultural dimensions. And one simple way of putting it I found when I was doing this, and there's an edited volume by me called Developmental and Cultural Nationalism, which has the results of that, of the research there. But as I put it in one of my writings, in one of my explanations, I said developmental nationalism promises you a better tomorrow. Cultural nationalism promises you a better yesterday. So take your pick. I mean, because it's all about harking back to the past, how the glories of the past, how we have to preserve the cultural and traditions and so on. And it's really, anyway, that's just a small. So the idea of the nation, of resistance to imperialism, anti-colonialism, the importance of independence in India, these were always very important for me. And for the rest, I would say that I also remember, you know, for my geopolitical economy, those of you who have looked at it will see that it is very centrally revolving around the so-called US hegemony, and particularly the dollar's role in it. And these interests also go back a very long way from when I became, you know, in my teens, I basically began to become a more serious student. And so on, and then I kind of read and listened to everything I could lay my hands on. So I've always been very involved in world affairs, and including the dollar's international role. So that has always been to me a subject of more great interest because, well, what does it rely on? What does it rest on? And I think I give my answer finally in geopolitical economy, but it was a long way. So these were the elements of, oh, and a couple of other points I should say is that in India, there is both a very strong Marxist tradition, and of course, as an adult, after learning about Marx, I dove into all the Indian scholars, and of course, I have since been privileged to meet some of them, and I think it's a fantastic Marxist tradition that we have in India. And on top of that, of course, there is also a very strong Keynesian tradition. Oddly enough, India and Italy are two countries which maintain a very, very strong Marxist, so a Keynesian tradition as well. And to me, the understanding of these two was always compatible, and we can discuss how both Marxists and Keynesians have been working very hard to destroy this compatibility, to give the wrong impression that they are not compatible. And actually, Alan and I have also written one article, and I've written several other in addition, talking about their compatibility. So that should give you some idea of my intellectual trajectory. And one final thing I'll say, given the given some of the more recent writing I've done, particularly around COVID, the state of capitalism today, and so on, is that as it happens, in my trajectory, I ended up studying what I call the most neoliberal economy. So thanks to partly to my choice of supervisor, who also taught me Marxism, Professor Colin Lees. I ended up studying the UK because I felt that of course I would always study India, but I also wanted to study something else. So I began with that, of course. Then I've also been writing a lot about India, and then as a result of my desire to write about imperialism, geopolitical economy, dollar hegemony, etc., I have ended up becoming a scholar of the US economy. So I feel that I've ended up being a scholar of some of the most neoliberal economies in the world, and then of course contrasting them with other kinds of economies that have been more productively oriented is a very important part. Maybe one final point about India. Living in India in the years that I did, from the sort of early 60s to the early 80s, I would say that the developmental state was very real. And the fact that capitalism has different national characteristics in different countries was, to me, it was a home truth. Like, I didn't have to be persuaded of this. And so therefore it was also very easy for me to understand that there are different types of capitalisms. Japanese capitalism, Swedish capitalism, American capitalism, French capitalism are all very different. And you have to understand the institutional context of these capitalisms. So all of these things, and therefore also different developmental states, are different. So that just gives you some of the background that I brought to the study with me. And then, I think I'll end there and then go on to other things later.
Thank you so much. Now, could you please explain for us the key concept of uneven and combined development, and particularly why we need to understand the dialectical relationship between both of the processes it names? You argue that while this dialectic is recognized in the work of Marx, the Bolsheviks, and early Marxist theories of imperialism, it has been regularly ignored in contemporary Western scholarship, where even Marxists who have addressed uneven development have paid insufficient attention to combined development. So please explain how the analysis you offer gives us a different picture of class struggle over the past century, including the central place in it of social development projects, as well as of nationalist, capitalist development in the Third World.
Sure. I mean, this is really the nub of my work on geopolitical economy in particular. So let me just give you a bit of a background. I started that book. When I started that book, I was going to say that I have always been a globalization skeptic. There are many others, people like Hurston Thompson, Linda Weiss, Robert Wade, etc. There are many of them. Because the thing is, if you have to understand that the world economy is a conglomeration of national economies, arranged, structured in hierarchical in relation to one another. That's certainly true, but we are not living in a sort of borderless world, a globalized world economy, not even as a process. So I always was very skeptical. And I began writing what became geopolitical economy as a critique of globalization, that globalization is wrong, and therefore the important question is not whether since globalization is wrong, the most important question is why did we suddenly start hearing so much about globalization beginning in the 1990s? And my answer to that question originally was going to be that it was a phase in the American management of its decline, of its hegemonic decline. So I took the idea of US hegemony for granted. I said, this is the frame. So within US hegemony, globalization is just a phase. They are trying to manage the hegemonic decline, which meant taking it for granted that US hegemony was once real and it was now declining. However, the more I read about it, I mean, if you try, I don't do this at home sort of thing, but if you try it, your head will spin. Every time you try to, just as every time you try to understand globalization, there are more definitions of globalization than there are writers. The same writer will use different definitions as they go along because one becomes inconvenient than another. Because these are ideologies, the facts will simply not fit, so they keep changing. Then I found a similar problem with hegemony, US hegemony. Every writer wants to define it differently now. And then I sort of began reading more historically, and I hit upon the solution. I was not going to define US hegemony by favoring this scholar versus that scholar. I said, I'm going to use the definition which US policymakers set themselves early in the 20th century when they set themselves the task of emulating the sort of dominance Britain once enjoyed in the world. They could see the British dominance was already weakening. So they said, we are a really big economy, we are already among the biggest, we are going to become the biggest, and we will become the managing segment of the world economy. In particular, we are going to do it by making the dollar the world's money, and New York the world's financial center. So I said, okay, this is going to be my benchmark, my understanding of how hegemony should be defined if we are going to say whether America has, or the US I should say, has succeeded or not. I've got lots of Latin American friends, so I'm always correcting myself when I say America. It's not America, it's the United States. But anyway, so how well the US succeeded or not. So that then became the benchmark I set, and that allowed me to then critique it. And my critique then came, I realized that not only was globalization wrong, but the ideas of hegemony were also wrong. What was true is that the United States had attempted to achieve this sort of dominance, but it had never succeeded. Even in, hegemony stability theories came into existence in the 1970s to retrospectively recast the 50s and 60s as a time of American hegemony, which was now in trouble. And now something else was needed, perhaps a refurbished American hegemony or something. People like Charles Kindleberger started writing their books and whatnot. Now, the thing about this was that, of course, you look at the 50s and 60s and you look at whether the US was able to install the dollar safely and securely as the world's money, and this was the farthest thing from the truth. So I realized that I was actually not just criticizing globalization, but also hegemony, ideas about hegemony. And I realized that what I was doing was I was criticizing all ideas that think that the world economy is a single seamless whole, whether it is united by markets, under free trade, globalization, etc., or united by a single hegemonic state. So these then I dubbed the cosmopolitan theories. And I have also came to the realization that cosmopolitan theories like 19th century free trade or globalization in the 1990s or US hegemony, empire, etc. in the 2000s, these are the ideologies under which some states try to create a seamless world economy, but this project cannot succeed. It never fully succeeded in the British case, even though Britain presided over an empire over which the sun never set and all those things. But even in the British case, it did not succeed. And the very factors that led to the eventual failure or the end of British dominance, such as it was, were the factors that were going to ensure that the United States would not succeed. So that the US hegemony was going to be impossible. British hegemony had been inevitable briefly, and US hegemony was becoming impossible. And that process was the increasing multipolarization of the world economy, and the dialectic of that, the process of that, comes from uneven and combined development. What do I mean by that? So, and this also connects up with a whole lot of other things, because as I was writing Geopolitical Economy, the theoretical needs of geopolitical economy required me to criticize a lot of received Marxist understandings, which of course I began to see more and more is the received Western Marxist understanding of capitalism. And what I found wrong there was the fact that back in 2010, so 3 years before I published Geopolitical Economy, I ended up writing an article, very long one, about, it was always puzzling me, why are so many Marxists saying that the demand problem does not exist? There are lots of Marxists, no demand problem. Marx never said there was a demand problem. But of course, I showed chapter and verse, volume 1, volume 2, volume 3, Grundrisse. It's everywhere. For him, it was the most fundamental problem. It was the most fundamental contradiction of capitalism. And so the more I looked into this, I realized that what had happened to Marxism, to Western Marxism, very early on, by the 1880s at the latest, is that already there were people who were calling themselves Marxists who did not really understand what Marx was saying in Capital. But they were trained, because they were trained in neoclassical economics, and then they tried to approach Marxism. They could never make head or tail of what value was, because that requires you to understand the terms in which classical political economy understood things. So they were strangers to this. The rise of neoclassical economics in the 1870s, 3 years after the publication of the first volume of Capital, is a major break in the history of economic thought. You don't get taught that. If you are lucky enough to take a history of economic thought course, you're taught as though it's a seamless beginning, from Sarah and Petty and whatever up to today. There is nothing seamless about it. Neoclassical economics is a brand new ideology that has to be trotted out and has to be invented in order to give capitalism a better justification, a better what's the word for it, legitimization than critical political economy, which retained too many seeds of critique of capital, could do by the time the working class started organizing in the late 19th century. Anyway, so this, so the encounter between neoclassical economics and Marxism, which should have been a clash. Marxists should have said, get out of the way, you are all wrong, this is ideological, you don't understand anything. Instead of that, apart from a couple of Marxists who did that, most of them tried to fit Marxism into the theoretical and methodological apparatus of neoclassical economics. It could never fit. Since it could never fit, it became an endless source of articles and books. Because you try this, you try that, it's not going to fit. But out of this, what Bukharin called a policy of theoretical reconciliation, came something called Marxist economics. And Marxist economics is basically, and I don't include everybody who is labeled Marxist economics. I don't include Alan, I don't include Ernest Mandel, for example. He used the label. But essentially, a lot of this has become about that. And of course, Alan and his friend Andrew Kleinman and some others have been trying to show that many of the conclusions to which Marxist economists arrive are wrong. And to me, the main wrong conclusion is the following. Marxist value analysis does not work because it suffers from a transformation problem. There is no transformation problem. You just have to learn to read capital properly. Read what's there. Don't parachute into it to pick out a couple of things that will fit with neoclassical economics. Just please don't do that. Read the whole of it. Number two, that Marx did not think that there was a demand problem. Marx thought there was a demand problem, big time. Number three, that Marx was wrong to think that rate of profit fell. Rates of profit are under constant downward pressure. They may be alleviated in various ways. Marx has an extensive discussion of it. And this, anyway, we can go on about this. I won't take too much time. But my point is, so as a result, you have a non-contradictory capitalism, which, number one, becomes capable of developing the forces of production forever. And number two, because it's not contradictory, it does not need imperialism. Right? Because only imperialism drives capitalism to expand. It is the economic basis, only contradictions drive capitalism to expand. They are the economic basis of imperialism. But, so anyway, so these are the three main accusations that are floating around. You will have encountered them if you take sufficient interest in Marxism. So, to me, then, this also has a further consequence. The wealth of capitalist societies is typically attributed by these people to a practically kind of Promethean ability of capitalism to expand the forces of production, when in reality, by far the largest contribution is made by imperialism. Imperialism makes rich countries rich and poor countries poor. That's the long and short of it. But once you say, so the Western Marxist position, best expressed, by the way, in Anthony Brewer's survey of theories of imperialism, capitalism does not need, imperialism happens, it's very sad, we feel for all those poor people, but it is not necessary for capitalism. This is the position they take. And this is complete rubbish. And it's rubbish according to Marx. Marx never thought. So in fact, various places I have cited Marx's wonderful expression, going back to the mid-1840s, when he's intervening in the debates on free trade. And he said, if these gentlemen cannot understand how one country can become rich at the expense of another country, how are they going to understand how one class becomes rich at the expense of another class? Right there, he's putting class and nation side by side as two axes of oppression, exploitation, etc., etc. So but the thing is, what happens is with Marx, the bits he publishes, remember, Capital was supposed to be a multi-volume work. Only one volume was published in Marx's time. Engels managed to put together two more, but they are nowhere near the fulfillment of the entire project. So it is an incomplete work. So we can only complete this incomplete work by the thing. So now, having laid that understanding, I will say what uneven and combined development are. So number one, imperialism is not only necessary. You cannot be a capitalist country without being imperialist, because otherwise eventually you will have such a multiplication of contradictions which you cannot deal with. Since you cannot be imperialist, your capitalism will melt down. And by the way, this is an important thing for what is happening to capitalist societies today, and we'll come back to it now. So, imperialism is necessarily expansions. Capitalist development is uneven, it develops in lumps and clumps, and as it develops in one part of the world, inevitably its expansionism has consequences for the rest of the world. Once it happens, therefore, the rest of the world faces a choice. Are you going to subordinate yourself to this advanced capitalism, or are you going to develop your own productive capacities in some fashion? So to me, the first phase of this took place already in the 19th century. Britain emerged as the first industrial capitalist country in the world, interestingly enough, not by competing with other capitalist powers, but by doing down handicraft production everywhere. In India, in China, you name it, everywhere. You do down the weavers and the spinners, like how, it's a bit like, you have a gun and you shoot down a few people with bows and arrows and that's it, great. But that was what British supremacy was based on. Then, so Britain becomes supreme. Now, for the rest of the world who have similar technological capabilities and political capabilities and so on, or need to acquire them, you have German unification, you have Meiji Restoration, you have the end of the Civil War in the US, etc. And all of these things set off attempts by these countries, the United States, Germany, Japan, to achieve a level of industrialization comparable to that of Britain, but in several ways in a different environment. Number one, they have to achieve it while Britain already commands supremacy on the world market. So for that, once that is the case, if you cannot industrialize unless you build protectionist walls, engage in so-called infant industry protection. It's a no-brainer. Liszt knew it, Hamilton knew it, various Japanese writers, people, you would have to be dumb not to know it. And Marx knew it, by the way. So, because this is happening in Marx's lifetime. Okay. So, they essentially engage in what I would call combined development. State-centered, protectionist, state-directed development of capitalism. Okay. These countries succeed, and their success by the late 19th century has already made the world multipolar. Okay, and there's a second difference. Which we can talk about later as well, but this has become more important in my work. By this time also, capitalism is making a leap from its first industrial revolution to a second industrial revolution. First industrial revolution based on small competitive industries, small firms, relatively low capital requirements, relatively light technology, relatively light products, etc. Second industrial revolution, huge capital requirements, big monopoly industry, railway, chemicals, metalworking, all of that, iron and steel, etc. All of these, this, uneven and combined development is about the, how capitalism sort of skips stages in different countries and so on. This is an exact example. So you've got competitive capitalism in Britain. You would have thought, well, since Britain is advanced in competitive capitalism, it will produce monopoly capital. It didn't. It actually produced a very weak form of it. Monopoly capital took its fullest forms in Germany, in the United States, and Japan. That's why they had a very different industrial structure to begin with, right? Anyway, so to me, combined development is this. For me, coming from, so now we can go back to my Indian context, the centrality of a developmental state. How can this not be understood? And also, by the way, one of the things I never understood, and part of the reason I had my developmental and cultural nationalism project was that I wanted to explore this. Nationalism has a very bad name in Western countries. And perhaps it should. Imperialist countries, nationalism equals imperialism, so that's pretty bad. But all nationalism for them was bad. And that's partly, of course, the sentiment on which ideas of globalization and so on rest. Every young person loves to think they're a citizen of the world. And if you're a white kid sitting in a first world country, it's great. If you are, however, born in India or the Middle East or Africa, you can't be a citizen of the world. You can't even step out of your own country without standing outside some miserable embassy for hours and hours looking for a visa or something. So it is not a spontaneous consciousness of the whole world. It's a spontaneous consciousness of certain types of young people, which is not their fault, but we have to recognize where it's at. So So to me, the developmental state was always important, and it's very interesting that Marxists don't touch the developmental state because for them imperialism is not a problem. So then countering imperialism is not a problem. It's a question of thinking about what's wrong with these countries, will they develop capitalism or not, etc., etc. And of course, if imperialism is not needed, the entire history of actually existing socialism can be dismissed as the work of a few misguided revolutionaries who shouldn't have done what they did, etc., etc. Lenin, whatever your particular take on it is. But the fact of the matter is that you can dismiss the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, every other as premature. It's not real socialism, etc. But if you take imperialism seriously, if you take the fact that, capitalism itself involves imperialism, so imperialism is simply the international face of capitalism. And for many countries, while for some countries it's okay, they develop capitalism in counter to capitalism, so German capitalism versus British capitalism. But for many other countries, it was simply not an option. They had to have such a high level of state intervention to even survive that essentially it had to become some kind of state, some kind of socialism. And you might as well build socialism. And one final point before I finish with this. You see, by the time you come to the early 20th century, capitalism has already entered the monopoly stage. And people forget that for Marx, this was the end of the historical utility of capitalism. Once you get to the monopoly stage, you no longer have those virtuous, even though chaotic and contradictory, but virtuous logic of increasing the forces of production, because monopoly doesn't need to have that. Monopoly can keep its advantages, it can, etc. So basically, once you have monopoly, it's ripe to be taken into public ownership, into social ownership. And that's what you see if you read, for example, chapter 27 of volume 3. It's all there. So take a good look at it. It's very easy to read chapter. So Marx already thinks this. So we have already come to a point where capitalism has matured to a point where it has nothing more to offer even to rich countries. It certainly didn't have much to offer to poor countries other than continued subordination, basically. So, although we have had, India in the 50s to the 70s, it did manage some sort of capitalist industrialization, but it always leaned distinctly on the socialist direction. Okay, so to me, combined development is critically important. That's one final point. So, basically, uneven and combined development is an understanding that is coined by Trotsky in the first chapter of the history of the Russian Revolution, and there are smatterings everywhere. But you find these writings even in other of Marx's writings. When Marx is comparing continental European countries to England, for example, there are various ways in which these international comparisons lend themselves to a UCD type of thing. Anyway, and he also understood very well that in order to industrialize against the might of Britain in the middle of the 19th century, you had to have a state-directed industrialization. But this, because you don't have the idea of contradiction, imperialism, etc., you then don't have the capacity to think about combined development. So basically, most Marxists didn't even refer to uneven and combined development. I came to it via a whole lot of detours. It was not taught to me ever. Number two, those who do use it only use uneven development. So, a lot of geographers, for example, talk about uneven development, which is great because there is also a tendency among Marxists to celebrate, into quotation marks, celebrate imperialism, because what it shows is the strength of capitalism. Imperialism is great, it's so strong, it will forever rule, etc., etc. And I'm not joking, this is often the tenor, they are so... there's so much capital worship in the Marxist world that that's what you end up doing. So they only use the concept of uneven development. Number three, those who use the concept of uneven and combined development reserve it for cases like the Soviet Union, like China, like Mozambique or Nicaragua or whatever, Cuba, to talk about attempts to resist imperialism in certain types of ways. Of course, there's another use of the term combined development, which is, to me, very nicely encapsulated in one of the images I grew up with. I grew up in a town called Baroda, then called Baroda, now called Vadodara. which is a big chemical complex industry. So as you drive out to the city, there are these huge refineries and fertilizer complexes and so on, and they are amazing things. If you've ever driven by a refinery, it's one giant piece of machinery, like many blocks big, right? So you have this on one side, and you have the highway with bullock carts going on the other side. So the existence of incongruous development and lack of development side by side is another use of the term combined development. But to me, if you read Trotsky, what he's talking about is German industrialization in particular, right? German industrialization cannot be understood without a state directed. So I always took combined development to mean that this kind of state-directed development, which was the only way of industrializing once you have the supremacy of one or more capitalist countries. You cannot industrialize in any other way. Imperialism will simply make you an agricultural appendage or a low-wage appendage of the capitalist world. You will never get there. So to me, this was always the dialect of uneven and combined development. And the final point, this will be the final point, is that so up to 1917 you had capitalist combined development, and after 1917, particularly in the 20s and 30s, you begin to have socialist combined development, and that is very critical. And that means that also opens a new chapter in the history of capitalism, which I now, compared to when I wrote Geopolitical Economy, I'm much more aware of it, that opens, to me, like socialist combined development is in geopolitical economy, but it also opens up a contestation of socialism and capitalism precisely at a point in time when capitalism has already reached maturity. It is now ripe for transformation, and the implication is we are paying the cost of not transforming it. So.
Great, thank you so much. That's so rich, Radhika. You've already touched on some of the other questions that we kind of shared a few questions in advance just to prepare for the conversation. I wonder if I could kind of combine two of them in one sense, because the image of the world that you're kind of giving to us really breaks with the way in which I was brought into the world. And I was taught that there's US hegemony, that capitalism reigns supreme, there's no alternative, etc., etc. And one of the things that your work does really powerfully is it centers imperialism, as you had just mentioned, and goes back to a certain tradition, right, of Lenin, the Bolsheviks, and others who also centered imperialism and recognized that class struggle was not just between classes in some traditional sense of the term, but was a geographic struggle between parts of the world and the materiality of nations, as you refer to it. And so I'm curious if you could flesh out for us a little bit more this paradigm shift. Like, you're basically telling people who I imagine share a lot of the worldview that I was inculcated into, that there's US hegemony or globalization or the kind of cosmopolitan thesis, that the world is totally different than that. Because it's a world in which there is uneven and combined development. There's a world in which there's class struggle globally, in which there are state-building projects, either through the case of those seeking a multipolar world that aren't necessarily oriented towards a socialist project, but then there are also the socialist projects that are combining in their development in order to try to leverage their development over the imperialist powers. And so could you kind of flesh out, even in the macro view, what's this larger view of the world that we're living in, and how does your geopolitical economy allow us to see that more clearly than the kind of cosmopolitan thesis?
So I certainly foreground imperialism in my writing, and so I would say there are a couple of interesting characteristics of the way at least that I'm conscious of the way I've done it, and therefore implicit critique of other positions. So obviously it criticizes a certain Western Marxist tradition which says that imperialism is not necessary to capitalism, but there is another Western Marxist tradition which is also important, and I would say equally worthy of attention, and that is the one I'm criticizing is the New Left Review tradition, the Brenner tradition, etc. But then there's the Monthly Review tradition, which has historically always paid a lot of attention to imperialism, and my hat's off to them. They have never denied that it exists. The difficulty is that because of that original encounter that I mentioned between Marxism and neoclassical economics, which gave rise not to a clash, but to an attempt at theoretical reconciliation, which has never succeeded and which has just preoccupied. It has involved so many great minds in the wrong question, which is very sad if you ask me. So that's where it has gone. But as a result of that, on the one hand, those who claim to be very consistent Marxists on the Marxist economics tradition are unable to theorize the relation between imperialism and capitalism. And those who take the reality of imperialism seriously are also unable to theorize that, so that they can only foreground imperialism in a relatively a-theoretical fashion. If you read Monthly Review, it's full of rich history, what the Americans did in Latin America, or what, the Belgians did in Congo. I mean, and it's great, we need that history, I'm not erasing it. What I'm saying is that what you also need is an understanding which directly sees imperialism as springing from the contradictions of capitalism. But Paul Sweezy is the one who published that book, with Bombauer's critique and Hilferding's response and so on. And you read Sweezy's preface to it, he says, there is no solution to this problem. There is a problem with Marx. He accepts that Marx's value analysis has a transformation problem. So once you do that, you cannot theorize, because you give up on value analysis. And then you cannot theorize capitalism as contradictory value production, which necessarily involves imperialism. So for me, imperialism is a very central reality. But because I have emphasized not just uneven development and therefore imperialism, but also combined development as a counter to it, my understanding of imperialism is also different, because there is also a tradition which says imperialism exists. It also comes from the world systems tradition, like Arrighi, Wallerstein, etc. Imperialism exists, and according to Arrighi, for example, he says in one or two of his books, American imperialism is even more powerful than British, etc. And there are different indicators of it, and Alan, who will talk tomorrow, and we have amazingly rich discussion, because he looks at some of the statistical figures, and I look at some of the broader analysis and so on, and it's a really interesting discussion we have. So yes, it's true that compared to say 1945, when the difference of income between average income between rich countries and poor countries was maybe 1 to 4 or 1 to 5 or something, and today it is like 1 to 40 or worse, something like that. Okay, so also prima facie, it's really big, imperialism must be more powerful. But on the contrary, there are also other things going on. So for me, this pushback against imperialism, first of all by making the capitalist world itself multipolar, leading to its great crisis, First World War, which was rooted in the competition of these big powerful capitalist countries, this imperial competition of the big powerful capitalist countries, leads to the First World War, the 30 years crisis, because of course the Second World War is umbilically linked to the First World War, because Versailles settled nothing. So the Second World War is also an inter-imperialist war, but with a critical difference. The side that won was a side that was aided by the socialist countries and socialist forces, particularly communist forces in China, and of course the Soviet Union, both of whom made make or break contributions. Without their help, we could well have been living under swastikas today. Okay, so in that sense, it was a more complex war, but nevertheless, it was still a same old crisis of imperialism. So anyway, the point is, to me, 1914 is the high noon of imperialism. After that, the sun of imperialism is beginning to decline. You get decolonization, and decolonization, it's also very fashionable among some Marxists to say, oh well, independence made no difference. This is simply not true. Rates of growth, for example, in a country like India, improved massively, even though Indian economies continue to bewail the so-called Hindu rate of growth, which was consistently very low. They couldn't get into, which was not, it was a self-disparaging. They are not Hindu nationalists, they are the opponents of Hindu nationalism. It was just a, what's the word, self-denigrating way of putting it. So, why are we trapped in this Hindu rate of growth, etc. But nevertheless, it was 3.5% was better than no percent. Right, so this was the big difference. So India grew, India industrialized, etc. So did many other countries. Development projects did not succeed equally well in all countries, but they have today brought the world to a point where there is sufficient economic development in all these countries that they cannot easily be overrun and dominated by other countries. The US can win wars against Grenada. Okay, great, it's like an ant and an elephant, wonderful. But they cannot dare, they have not won any other serious wars with even medium-sized countries. It is not possible. Partly, of course, because the forces of socialism still exists. And now, of course, at the present moment, we are looking at the emergence of a new type of anti-imperialist alliance with the increase, the West has, of course, forced Russia into the China embrace as well, but that embrace was already happening. It makes sense for a country like Russia if it doesn't want to become just another imperial, subordinated to imperialism, etc. So a new set of forces are coming into existence today. So my point about imperialism is that since 1914 it has been declining. Decolonization does make a difference. Perhaps we wish it made a bigger difference, but we can discuss that further. That the attempt by the forces of capital to reimpose imperialism under the guise of neoliberalism in the 80s and 90s seemed to work spectacularly for those 2 decades, but by the new century, also there was a reaction, a sort of a wave of resistance in the form of various forms of combined development. Of course, the most successful example of combined development today is socialist China. There is no doubt that there is a huge, one of my colleagues even said, and I think he was right about this, China represents the greatest industrial revolution known to humankind. Britain may have been the first, but China involves the most massive productive forces, the biggest population, etc., in a massive industrial revolution. So this is all, and you cannot do this without clearly, China did not do it by opening up to market forces. China did it by maybe employing market forces to some extent, but by retaining the overall management of the economy, including its trade and investment relations internationally. You cannot do it otherwise. Korea didn't do it that way. Taiwan didn't do it that way. You think of the most important examples of development and you will find the role of the developmental state. So for me, combined development has always involved that, will continue to involve that simply for the simple reason that existing capitalist countries can only offer to the rest of the world subordination. If you want anything else, you've got to make it yourself on your own steam and with state-directed means.
That's great, that's really helpful. Jen, I might just, in the interest of time, we just have 1 or 2 other questions, and one of them that I really wanted to ask Radhika relates to an earlier conversation that we had in the workshop, and that is, you have this excellent article that, again, I'd highly recommend people look into called The New Communists of the Commons, 21st Century Prudentists. And we're changing gears here in the conversation a little bit, but it is a critique of some of the most prominent and visible Western Marxists, or at least self-proclaimed Marxists, people like Alain Badiou, Hart and Negri, Zizek, and you describe them as Prudentists. For a room like ours, could you maybe begin by explaining what is a Prudentist, right? And then secondly, why was it important for you to situate their work in terms of a kind of 19th century ideology that of course is very close to anarchism, and what does their prominence reflect about the larger tendencies of the Western intelligentsia, and as well those who would be most prominent in a world of an attempted imposition of US hegemony and things of this nature that we were just talking about?
Sure. So, very quickly, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon was a French socialist writer. He wrote a very famous book called The Philosophy of Poverty, and in which he basically said these famous things like property is theft and that sort of thing. And he tried to understand capitalist production historically in after a certain fashion. And of course, and Marx and Proudhon were actually originally great friends, and there are some amazing stories of them staying up till the late hours, discussing everything and so on. But eventually, after the publication of the Philosophy of Poverty, Marx took great exception to this. And really, in a certain sense, you can all see Marx as sort of, sharpening his intellectual tools on Proudhon's work, because Marx then wrote a critique of this philosophy of poverty, and it was called The Poverty of Philosophy. And it is one of the most wonderful and biting critiques you can read of. And Marx was he had a really sharp tongue, and you never wanted to be on the other side of a tongue lashing by Marx. But nevertheless, but I think the sharpness is also a sharpness of his his insight into what's really going on. Because, Marx has this amazing way, not only of saying X, Y, Z is wrong, but he also explains why this person is wrong. What are they assuming which leads them to these conclusions? So essentially, Proudhon constructs a socialist world that consists essentially of a little bit of like what these days is very common, very common notions. We will have cooperatives and autonomous, worker-managed enterprises and so on and so forth, and then these will all exist in a kind of broader sea of market relations, etc. And Marx said, look, this is the big fallacy. Capitalism is always legitimized in the name of freedom by saying that, you can be autonomous, you can be your own producer, you can be your own boss, etc. And this is the freedom capitalism gives you. But the reality of capitalism is, number one, this sort of freedom is only freedom from the personal domination of your boss. But it is no freedom from the impersonal domination of extremely harsh market forces. That is why small businesses continue to mushroom and be, as in Rosa Luxemburg's very evocative phrase, be mowed down periodically in crises, right? So this is the fate of small business, and this is particularly the case in our era of capitalism where monopoly is true. How many of us does not know the small business owner who quakes when he hears that a Walmart is going down the road or whatever, right? This is the fate of the small business owner. And Marx says that what Proudhon doesn't understand is that you cannot have capitalism without this logic developing. There is not going to be a sea of petty property. There will always be from that, even if there were such a sea of petty property, eventually the mechanics of competition will give rise to monopoly, and it will condemn all this sea of petty property to the same fate. And then Marx says something really interesting. He says that these people like Proudhon, they do not understand. They think of freedom as the freedom not to be a worker. So for them, a planned economy where we are all workers together is still unfreedom. That's why they reject planned economies. Because they cannot, their bourgeois brains have become so addled that the only freedom they can imagine is the freedom of not being a worker. But they cannot imagine the freedom of a collective freedom where we are all autonomously, collectively, with freedom, making social decisions about what to produce, how to produce it, etc., etc., which is what we will all have to get to at some point, right? We're not going to escape that. So, unless you want to continue to live in an increasingly irrational, and I would say murderous capitalism, and we'll come back to murderous in a minute. But, so that's Proudhon. What is Proudhonist about these people? Essentially, I call this Badiou, Zizek, etc. They are basically expressing. I should say Zizek is particularly difficult to discuss because one day he says this, the other day he says the opposite. So I'm only going by certain texts that are written. So okay. So this is just the spontaneous consciousness of the professional managerial class, and this actually ties into a really interesting thing because you see. Why do I suddenly name the professional managerial class? Well, cast your mind back to Poulanzas. Poulanzas talked about the old petty bourgeoisie of the small producers and then the new petty bourgeoisie of the intellectual workers, the professional managerial class. And so to me, today the small petty bourgeoisie is a political force only as a sort of handmaiden of the worst forms of right-wing politics, as you know, the Trumpist and so on. So, but what we have seen compared to the age of Proudhon and Marx, and even probably the age of Poulanzas, we have seen a vast multiplication of the professional managerial class, which capital must employ in its increasingly bureaucratic functioning. Remember, with the monopoly stage of capitalism, every big capitalist corporation is nothing more than a giant planned economy. That's what it is. So why not, so right now it is privately owned and controlled, why not make it publicly owned and controlled? That's the only difference. That's the one, and by the way, there are these two very smart guys, I can't remember their name, but they wrote a very funny book called The Republic of, what is the People's Republic of Walmart? I do suggest you take a look at it. It's good fun, but it makes a very good book, and it's worth taking a look at. So, where was I going with this? Yes, so the thing is that This professional managerial class is increased in numbers, and by the way, they are increasingly concentrated in first world countries, which is where bulk of this work takes place. That's why the, designed in Britain but manufactured in Indonesia or whatever, this sort of thing happens. China is increasingly, of course, internalizing that. It's no longer designed in Britain and manufactured in China, it's also designed in China, but we will leave that aside. But this is the relationship that is offered. So essentially these people are numerous, they form a class, their spontaneous consciousness is cosmopolitan. They were the driving forces behind the ideology of globalization, and in the European context the ideology of European integration remain in the case of the UK, etc., because for them the whole world is their oyster. They can go today and work in Indonesia, tomorrow in Ireland, and day after tomorrow in Iceland, and so on. And they love that. And in the case of the EU, you have your EU passports and all that. And they love the idea that for them and their children, opportunity is so wide. My daughter is dancing in Milan, and my son is a financier in Geneva, and they just love all this. So anyway, this is the spontaneous consciousness, and they, therefore, for them, their freedom to do their work, etc., is the ultimate freedom. Okay, and this is these ideas about democracy and communism, etc., they are presenting as simply their ways of saying, essentially, that we are already living in some kind of communism, because that's how they experience it, and we don't need anything else. Right? So anyway, I would say that this class is actually right now turning out to be a really serious issue, because today it is part of the neoliberal establishment which marries economic neoliberalism with a little bit of social liberalism. So we want women's formal rights, not substantial rights. Women should be free to work anywhere, which means that they should also perhaps be free to become prostitutes and home cleaners and what have you. Women should, there should be all sorts of other sorts of freedoms for people. But in reality, the reality is very complex. And by the way, they also need racial diversity, because they have become a racially diverse class. Why? Because imperialism sucks out the brains out of every other society and brings it to the metropoles. One of the things we don't recognize about imperialism is that it very much relies on importing labor. The whole issue of the import of labor is so badly understood, because people think that, we are letting them in, the poor souls, they want to come and we are letting them in. No, you need them. Yeah. You have always needed them. You have wanted, the reason and what you've done is you have created spigots. So you close everything off, and then you have a tap. You open the tap when you want, like Mrs. Merkel saying, we'll take 1 million of you, and then you close the tap when you don't want, right? So, so the thing is that this is a critical thing, and this includes the importation of high-end labor, which is routine today. And middle-class people in every third world country are encouraged to think that they should be able to work anywhere. And I should also add that they in their respective countries, they are the carriers of the ideology of globalization and blah blah and so on. And of course, it is far easier for them to emigrate. It's difficult still, but it is far easier for them than for most of their compatriots. And of course, when they emigrate, they will have far better positions. They will have high-paying jobs, whereas if you are a taxi driver, if you are a nurse, if you are a hotel cleaner, you are going to be at the very bottom end of the social scale. And you're going to have to work really hard, all those things. So anyway, to me, those sorts of ideas as represented by Zizek, Badiou, etc., they are the spontaneous consciousness of these people. And I guess one could discuss more, but that's all I'll say for now. Yeah.
Thank you. Now you wrote an excellent 7-part commentary on COVID, where you argue that the pandemic should be understood as a crisis of capitalism. You also outline the upending of the neoliberal economic order and discuss the current and future struggles of the left and right to take the lead in recomposing the socioeconomic order. So in light of this analysis, how would you describe the current state of global class struggle? How also have social democratic projects in the West abandoned the working class and created opportunities for burgeoning fascism? And where do you see the most promising developments, both in the West and internationally?
Yeah, so let me
jump in real quick and just say I can start taking stack, and or if people online want to start raising their hands, because we'll transition to questions after this.
Okay, great. So very quickly then, actually this 7-part series that I did is now being turned into a book, and I should say that I would have published it last summer. I would have finished it last summer, but various things happened and I couldn't. So I only submitted it like 2 or 3 weeks ago. But that had the fortuitous effect that I also rolled in my analysis of the current proxy war against Russia by the West. So the original title of the book was going to be Capitalism, Coronavirus and Capitalism, but now it's retitled Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, colon, a Geopolitical Economy. It's a very wide-ranging book in many ways, but it is exactly directed to the questions that, Jennifer, you raised. So, very broadly, one other prefatory point before I dive into it. You mentioned the Social Democrats and what social democracy has done. So, this work that I did on neo-Proudhonism, the professional managerial class, etc., also ties in with my first book, which was about the intellectuals and socialism, in which I looked at I won't bore you with it too much, but I looked at the historic relationship between intellectuals and socialism, which has always been there. You know, the Fabians in Britain used to, in their very quaint and direct way, call it brains and numbers, the alliance of brains and numbers. They were the brains and everybody else was the numbers. But anyway, the point is that they love to think of it that way. But the fact is there was such an alliance. Marx alludes to it, Lenin alludes to it. There was, and a lot of sociological writers, including some Russian ones, said, you know, this is a result of an overproduction of intellectuals in Western countries, where so many of them go over to the opposing side. They are not working for capital, but they are working to oppose capital. And indeed, it was a thing back then. Now the thing is changed, because so many of these intellectuals are employed by corporations, and many more are employed by neoliberal states who service corporations, provide corporations with their biggest opportunities. This professional managerial class has been the vector that has taken social democracy from even some kind of reformist tradition to essentially a form of neoliberalism. So that in Britain today you can have Labour neoliberalism or you can have conservative neoliberalism and maybe liberal democratic neoliberalism, whatever. And those are the choices. Whereas, you know, in the 1970s there was a big clash, you know, right wing moved further to the right, and you would have thought the left wing would have moved further to the left. No, the left wing also moved to the right. And so the entire political spectrum shifted, and the key carriers of this, the people who hounded Jeremy Corbyn, think of them, they are the key carriers, the people who are in the Parliamentary Labour Party today, that's who they are. Okay, so where does that leave politics today? So in this 7-part series and in this book, what I argue is that capitalism was already due for a big crisis, and in fact, you know, I was paying no attention whatsoever to the coronavirus outbreak in early 2020. In December of 2019, Alan and I had actually been to China. We didn't hear anything about this, and even after coming back, we paid no attention. So without paying any attention to that, I was asked to come and give a talk, and if you look at Radhika Desai, Does Capitalism Have a Future?, you'll see that talk. So already in February 2020, I was giving a talk in which I began by saying, my title is, Does Capitalism Have a Future? And the short answer is no. And then I gave a longer talk telling them why. So already capitalism was in deep doo-doo back then. 2019 was also a year of big popular protests, which continued into the pandemic year, as you all know. Okay, so capitalism is in deep crisis. It is unable, you know, throughout the neoliberal era, it has produced less and less growth every decade. Since 2008, the situation has become dire. So at one level, so that's the state of capitalism. But where is the state of politics? You would have thought that 40 years of neoliberalism would have given the left great opportunity to develop and expand, because after all, what is neoliberalism? It is just putting more and more pressure on working people, taking away their privileges, rolling back the welfare state, keeping wages low, making working conditions worse. I mean, what's not to organize about? But there was no organization, for the simple reason that, in a certain sense, the West had its own form of neoliberalism. because the currents of thought which said capitalism can continue developing the forces of production without end. Capitalism does not need imperialism. Capitalism, there is no demand problem. The rate of profit does not fall. All of these currents became really powerful precisely in this era. So the left was going down the wrong, or barking up the wrong tree, basically. And so there is no organization of the left. And in the absence of the organization of the left, what happens is that opportunistic, charlatan, right-wing forces like Trump, like Johnson, have been able at least to mobilize some sections of the working class in favor of extremely reactionary models. But what's the option? This reactionary model, while Trump and Johnson are both extremely unattractive people, how is Hillary Clinton or President Biden any more attractive? But these are the options we have. I mean, if anything, at least Trump didn't start a new war. Biden is not only started a new war, but Obama continued wars, etc. So I think we have the following choice: this resurgent right wing, or this neoliberal, socially liberal, and I put socially liberal in heavy quotation marks, establishment. And I put socially liberal in heavy quotation marks because they love to talk about women's rights and blah blah and so on, but they never deliver. So it's the Clintons, Obama, never did anything about abortion laws. Now look at where American women are at. They could have, they promised to. They said we are going to pass a law. They never did. It was never their priority. So they, first of all, and they are the culprits. They have accepted the neoliberalism that has brought Western working classes to a very dire state, by the way. The old privileges of imperialism are hardly there anymore for Western working classes. But there is no organization, and in this context we have, we have this, we can only have increasing dysfunction, basically. And it could very well be that both the United States and the UK, where these problems are the most advanced, and which my book focuses on, as you know, this is the worst situation, but in parts this is happening elsewhere as well. You can look at, it is more likely that the UK will disintegrate into its component nations than it is that there will be a socialist revolution in the UK, which is sorely needed. When people have to choose between heating and eating, you need a socialist revolution. Like you don't need any deep analysis. So unfortunately, the thing is that there are all these forces driving us to that place, but there is no force, there are not no forces, but let's say the established left forces are not really equipped to direct this discontent in a proper way. One final point, therefore, increasingly now what is happening is that there are left-wing forces are beginning to realize the materiality of nations, and now we have talk of patriotic socialism. Now, we have to discuss this very carefully, because any socialism does have to begin in its own national envelope. That is the beginning. It's not its end, but that is definitely the beginning. But at the same time, a lot of these so-called patriotic socialists are misdiagnosing a lot of things. They consider, for example, the convoy in Canada, for example, to be a genuine left force. I don't think it is. In fact, it is tied up with. But again, it's even more complex than that. The battle between socialism and fascism is precisely the battle for the soul of the working class. So it may very well be the case that many working class people are involved in this. But then we have to pull them in a different direction. So it leaves the left, after decades of left failure, in a very, very bad position at a time when it should have been its finest hour. But it isn't. So I'll end there for now.
Well, I think we can open up, and if it's okay with you, we'll take a group of questions, like 2 or 3. I think Nico's going to start us out.
Break this. Well, good. All right. Yeah, so thank you so much for that. I had my sort of particular, concern, or the one I wanted to ask you about was sort of your conception of neoliberalism and its place in the history of the global economy, right? So one thing I hear, even though I don't love Mark Fisher's sort of weird metaphysical takes, he did describe neoliberalism as this sort of death spasm, this sort of hit and run job, which is sort of the last attempt at converting imperialism into something that could possibly be solvent, right, in the face of the sort of death throes of global capitalism, at least in the state that we know it, right? One thing I wanted to focus on sort of within that realm was thinking about your description of the sort of professional managerial class, the PMC, as this new sort of global capitalist class, and the sort of traditional petty bourgeoisie, right? The sort of, we might say artisans almost, right? So I'm thinking here sort of specifically of William I. Robinson's work on Latin America. So for him, this is sort of the central new, not the central conflict, but perhaps the most prominent newest conflict in this development of capitalism, right? Is this conflict between this transnational bourgeoisie or petite bourgeoisie and the sort of national sort of analog to that, right? Which is to say that while globalization sort of remains uneven, there's obviously, say, more wealth in the United States than there is in Mexico, for instance, there still is a sort of thriving bourgeoisie and professional managerial class within Mexico, which is focused less perhaps on what you describe as combined development, and more so in sort of joining a sort of transnational capital class, right? More that's sort of invested in joining that, right? So I just wanted to ask for you, because you sort of, as you described, the history of capitalism and sort of this linear thing, is neoliberalism then one of those sort of ruptures in the history of global capitalism that created those sort of new divides, or is it more so sort of this attempt of, in your view, of reasserting this unique United States hegemony? Because I think for Robinson, it's more about the logic of the market sort of overcoming everything, and even though the nation functions as an instrument of that, it becomes sort of the second unit by which you might look at it. It might become subordinate to the market as such. So I just wanted to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, can we take 2 more? Yes, of course.
I think it was a Pedro and then Roman.
Yeah.
Hello. My question is also about neoliberalism, so I think it segues well. Recently I read a book by Wendy Brown called Undoing the Demos, and in there she talks about, I guess I'll qualify, the reason I thought about this question is you talked about neoliberalism gaining a lot of force in the 80s and 90s and then kind of losing it a little bit, but the argument that Wendy Brown makes is that she talks about neoliberalism as a governing rationality, in the sense that the same logics that govern the market become also kind of organized at a cognitive, psychological level, also the behavior of individuals within a neoliberal economy. And I was wondering if that's how you think about things, if that form of analysis is something that you take into consideration, if it's helpful or not when thinking about these problems, because it is less of a materialist look and more of a, I guess, psychological, if you will, approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really, really great and very insightful. Yeah, I have a similar question on imperialism, but once you were talking about the lack of organization and things like that, so I was thinking about the relationship between neoliberalism and imperialism, and kind of like the relationship between the co-optation of certain movements, right? Because that's true, like neoliberalism co-opts certain movements in the imperial core, but as well as in the global south, right? So kind of maybe outlining the relationship between how neoliberalism facilitates imperialism, or maybe imperialism facilitates neoliberalism, and kind of what, just kind of the relationship between them historically, because then with the rise of neoliberalism in the 70s, how has that bolstered imperial powers?
Good. Okay, so many different things. I'm so glad you brought this up, because it reminds me that there are big chunks of my understanding that I've left out, even though I gave a very lengthy set of answers earlier. So first of all, I define neoliberalism a certain way, and again, I discuss this in the forthcoming book at some length. Most people think neoliberalism is about markets versus state, and about competitive markets and so on. And I say several different things about it. First of all, very broadly speaking, it's not about markets versus state. It's about giving capital freedom. Okay, this is the key. Capital gets to do what it likes, and indeed making the state subservient to its interests. So not only does the state give capital freedom, the state also gives capital more and more opportunities to make risk-free profits. so that more and more of state services are contracted out. These are necessary, like you can't give up garbage collection or hospital laundries or whatever. So they get these contracts and they make cost plus profits without any problems, etc. And so this also deals with the whole issue of falling profits. At least it shows that up. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now, however, neoliberal ideology says that if you give capital freedom, if you tax it less, if you